publishes their tax return publicly. Everyone knows what everyone earns and how much tax they pay. We tend not to know what the very rich pay, though. Why not? Well, because they've got lots of different ways of not just avoiding tax perfectly legally, but also evading tax. Now, the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell has promised that if there's a Labour government elected in 2020, that he would like to force the rich to make their taxes public. And any taxpayer who earns more than £1 million a year will have to be completely transparent and make their own tax records public. This, of course, comes just ahead of next week's first full budget from Philip Hammond. That's on the 8th of March. But John McDonnell has told the Guardian newspaper that more transparency about individuals' tax affairs, particularly the high earners, would actually cut down on tax avoidance and would encourage a more open civic culture, he says. Let's talk to Salman Shaheen, who's the editor of the International Tax Review, who joins us now. Hello, Salman.
Hi there.
Hello. Well, look, obviously, I think we have to have the proviso of if a Labour government is elected in 2020. But there'll be an awful lot of people listening to this who'd very much like to see what the high earners are earning and indeed what tax they're paying. So do you think this would actually have an effect other than just being quite good reading for the likes of journalists and just those of us who wants to know, oh, is he earning that much? Oh, is she earning that much? Actually, would this actually have a change in terms of the amount of tax that the very rich pay?
I absolutely agree with John McDonnell on this issue. I think it's a very astute policy, and I think it would be a very popular policy as well. It would not only encourage the high earners, and let's be very clear, we're talking about the exceptionally high earners, people who are earning over $1 million a year, not just the standard high earners who are earning 150k a year. These are the super rich high earners. It would encourage them to pay their taxes, to be transparent in their affairs, and to shy away from anyone who's thinking about using any of these bespoke schemes that they can have set up, which are not available to the likes of you and I, but are very readily available to these sorts of people. It would also, quite rightly, as John McDonnell says, instill a sense of civic duty. And tax morale is incredibly important. If people everyday people who are working hard, paying their taxes, be they self-employed or employed by a PAYE, if they start to see that there's one set of rules for them and yet another set of rules completely different for the super rich, then they begin to question the whole system. And it's this questioning of the elites which has led us to Brexit and all the horrors that we're seeing unleashed upon our economic system today.
Democracy, it's a terrible, terrible thing, isn't it, Simon? But this is the thing. I agree with you on the tax morale thing. I pay my taxes, quite happy to pay my taxes, don't fiddle my taxes. I mean, I'd be silly to admit to it if I did, but I pay what I'm due, and I don't resent paying what I'm due because I know that's just, as you say, part of living in civic society. And the reality is, for most of us, actually, most people are on PAYE anyway, we don't get a chance to fiddle our taxes. We don't get to have nice one-on-one meetings with special tax advisors or have accountants who are paid tens of thousands of pounds. And we also don't get special deals with Her Majesty's taxman who seems to do these deals with the very, very, very rich, and whether people who own massively big companies in terms of deals with corporation tax or the real high earners. And so I agree with you on that. We need to know that, look, we're paying our share, they're paying their share, and then everyone feels better about it. But is it going to actually make them pay more taxes? Because the reality is a lot of people who are the seriously high earners, and we're not talking about top 10% or even top 1%, we're talking about the seriously, seriously high earners. There are only a couple of 100,000 of them in this country. A lot of them are either take their tax affairs abroad if they can. An awful lot of the others as well. Their money they're not getting a salary of £1 million a year. Why? Because that's tax inefficient, and they've got every right, like you or I do, to minimise legally the tax they pay. It'll be being paid in dividends, paid in other ways, and an awful lot of the other ways that the very rich get their income. You don't actually have to submit on a tax return, do you?
That's right. I mean, people can set up companies and take a smaller income from that and manage their tax affairs that way, quite rightly, as you point out. I think what it would do, though, if we were to implement this kind of system, is it would draw a very sharp line between avoidance and evasion. We'd know exactly who was breaking the law and who was just bending the law.
Would we be able to deduce that from the numbers on the tax return? I have to say, I can barely understand my tax return, and it's my tax return. So, I mean, would we? I mean, okay, investigative journalists and the like would be looking at this, but would we actually be able to seriously understand someone's finances by looking at their tax return?
I mean, it would be quite simple, I believe, this system. It is intended to show how much someone earns and how much tax they pay on those earnings. And if there's a discrepancy, then it's something to look into. It might not be the complete answer, but it does point one in the direction of the right answer. And it is good that journalists, and they do this in the Nordic countries, can use these as a tool to investigate people and see if they're playing by the rules.
I mean, we know, of course, there have been some speculation about Donald Trump's tax returns. Obviously, a very different system in America, and he is absolutely alone in the last, goodness me, quite a few decades of a presidential candidate, certainly a victor, to have refused to publish his tax returns. But there were some leaks that suggested that this is a man who hadn't actually paid any tax for about 9 years on his income, despite being a billionaire. Do you think that if there was information like that came out about some of our politicians, some of whom, and there's quite a lot of millionaires in the cabinet when you look at the value of their property holdings and inheritances and the like, some quite rich folks, certainly they were under the Cameron administration, that this would actually affect how people vote?
I'm an optimist. Some might call me naive. I'd like to believe that politicians across all parties are good public servants, no matter what we think of their policies. They're good public servants who are unlikely to want to be caught out dodging taxes. They will probably be fairly by the book. I mean, John McDonnell, I believe, has published his, and I'm sure plenty of Tories equally would be happy to sign up to the same kind of system. So I don't think we're going to see a great deal of tax avoidance scandals coming out if politicians start putting their affairs on record. I mean, the closest we got with David Cameron from the Panama Papers was through his father, and really that was a controversy because Cameron just fudged the truth somewhat. And
but also it was the fact that
the question directly.
Yes, and also there was £30,000 that were in shares, but which clearly was a sum that he thought was quite trivial and not worth mentioning, and that was a bit of an indicator of, wow, you live in a different realm from the rest of us, where 30 grand is an awful lot of money and a lot more than most people earn in a year gross. But this thing, I wonder, in terms of the culture in Norway and Sweden, this culture of publicising tax returns, it didn't come about because people weren't paying their taxes. This has just been the normal state of affairs for decades, has it not? And in which case, do you think that has meant that there is more honesty in tax affairs that has come about as a result? And do you seriously think that would be the net effect here as well?
It's been the normal state of affairs for centuries, I believe. I think it goes back to the 1800s. Britain, I mean, we're a peculiar bunch, aren't we? I mean, we don't like talking about money. We love earning it, but don't like knowing how much other people earn or talking about it.
No, we love knowing what other people earn. We just don't want them to know what we earn.
Well, yes, indeed. It would involve somewhat a change of culture. But I mean, again, the Nordic countries, they're doing it across the board largely. I mean, this would really only be for the super rich. I mean, I don't think John McDonnell is suggesting we should all start publishing our tax returns, and nor do we need to, because we're all on most of us on PAYE anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't think it needs an across the board change in culture, but it will require some changes.
But it's interesting in terms of the aims of this, because I remember when I think a Tory MP once suggested how we should, I know it was thrown out like this idea, how we should know who is on benefits and who's not on benefits. So in any given street, we would know that it should be public knowledge that someone was in receipt of housing benefit or benefits for being jobless or whatever, and then tax credits and the like, because they were receiving public money. And this was people as absolutely outraged. This was going to target people. But on the same basis, you could argue that having rich people having their tax returns public, we largely would be able to identify where these people live. Certainly journalists would be able to do so. This is a little bit of pointing and accusing rich people, isn't it? In the same way as was suggested that it was effectively going to happen with people at the bottom end of the income scale who in receipt of public money, which idea being that this would be a good way of exposing people who were up to no good, who were working but secretly claiming benefits, or and actually showing people where their taxes were going. It works both ways.
Of course, benefit fraud is a problem, and it should be absolutely cracked down on. But I think it's important to remember that it's a tiny, minuscule fraction of people who are claiming benefits.
That's fraud in the full sense of it being criminal. But in terms of the number of people who are actually able to get a job but choose not to work full time, it's actually in the millions.
And yet the money to borrow a phrase from Boris Johnson would be chicken feed in comparison to the amount that is
Oh,
evaded and avoided by
yeah.
multinational corporations and the super rich. I mean, of course, transparency across society is a positive thing, but again, this would require another change in culture because at the moment we have this stigma culture. We've got Benefit Street going out on Channel 4.
Is that
And
still going?
there are people who, well, I don't know, I've never watched it, but it's almost sort of like stigmatizing the poor for receiving benefits. And some people genuinely do need a helping hand from the state to get by. So, I mean, I
Absolutely.
think we shouldn't have a system which makes people feel ashamed that they need help into work.
Well, no, I certainly wouldn't think that's one of the reasons why the idea was thrown out. Perhaps we shouldn't be trying to shame people who earn £1 million a year. I'm not one of them. I wish I was married to one of them, but it seems to be an awful lot of people who do have that sort of income coming in, which suggests it's an income rather than inherited it from daddy. Probably worked darn hard to get there. And most of us would just like to be them rather than attack them. That's just me, though.